Originally made by Michelangelo Buonarroti between 1501 and 1504, the statue of David is considered one of the masterpieces of Renaissance sculpture and one of Michelangelo's two finest sculptures. The sculpture, which exceeds 5 meters in length, has been exhibited since 1873. The statue represents the moment when David decided to attack Goliath. Michelangelo used Carrara marble in the construction of the statue. Today, the statue of David has become a part of popular culture. Rumor has it that after Michelangelo completed David, he found him so realistic that he threw his hammer at him and exclaimed, "Damn it if you talk to me." Simon Blake examined the statuette he was holding for a long time, turning it over, bringing it closer to his face and moving it away. Unlike the original, which was carved from marble, it was made of sepiolite, meerschaum. Then Blake left the room, leaving the miniature statue about 30 centimeters long on his desk. A few minutes later, he returned with a lens and sculptor blades that he had used briefly as a student. He began to examine David through the lens this time and much more carefully. After a while, he noticed that the statue had a cut that covered the entire part of the statue that connected his pelvis with the thigh bone of his left leg. Since there were cracks and marks in places on the whole statue, this situation did not attract attention. Choosing one of his knives, he began work to separate David's left leg from the torso. When he was done about an hour later, it turned out that a cylindrical glass tube, 5 centimeters long and 1 centimeter in diameter, had been stored with the leg above the knee. Inside the tube was a roll of paper and a miniature technological apparatus that Blake couldn't guess what it was for the time being. Bingo. Thank you, David. Boris Pavlov, who had recovered to some extent from his surprise and nausea, looked at the rotting skull of the assassin, who he guessed had been buried here for at least a month. That's not what he expected to find. He tried to gather his head to decide what he should do. He couldn't leave the body here. He couldn't take it with him. It was not in his interest that the incident was learned by his colleagues and reflected in the press. He just stood there for a while and waited. In the end, he decided that reporting the situation to the police was the most prudent thing to do. Simon Blake opened the cap of the small glass tube and retrieved the note inside. He began to read the note, written in elegant handwriting with a fountain pen long ago. My growing discomfort with the way things were progressing dates back to a few months before the Apollo 1 tragedy on January 27, 1967. At that time, I frequently met with my close friends Virgil Grissom and John Young, and we had long conversations whenever we could. The three of us suspected there was something behind the space travel narrative beyond the Cold War-era US-USSR rivalry or scientific curiosity promoted by mainstream media. We had valid reasons for our suspicions. The issue dated back a few years before the accident. According to Virgil and me, it began in late 1964 or early 1965. According to John, it could be traced back to a few months before the assassination of J.F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963. Around that time, two extremely peculiar and unsettling individuals began appearing frequently at the White House and NASA. One was a man, the other a woman, both in their 40s. The man was always dressed entirely in black and had light blonde hair, almost white. He probably didn't speak English, or if he did, he didn't use it. Instead, he usually spoke in German and occasionally in Russian. The woman was the truly intriguing one. She had an exceptionally well-proportioned physique and an impressive face. Her attire didn't match any style we were accustomed to seeing in the present or past, at least not to my knowledge. Her hair, a striking yellow, was almost long enough to touch the ground. No one ever witnessed her communicating directly with anyone. She spoke with her partner in a language none of us could understand. The man would translate her statements into German and convey them to White House or NASA officials, and he would translate their replies into that strange shared language. No one knew their nationality, where they had come from, where they stayed during their time in America, their names, their purpose, or the duration of their stay. They entered and left the White House as they pleased and spoke informally with the president. Virgil grew increasingly worried as the launch date for Apollo 1 approached. During one of our usual conversations, he mentioned suspecting someone of leaking information. He believed technical preparations weren't progressing as they should. Was he referring to the sci-fi-like woman and her companion I mentioned earlier, or was the outside he referred to something else? I never knew. Then it happened. On January 27, 1967, Virgil and his crew perished in a fire that broke out in the command module of Apollo 1. While I may never be able to prove it, I am convinced the explosion was somehow connected to those two peculiar characters. NASA recovered from the tragedy sooner than I expected. The same mission was revived about a year and a half later, now named Apollo 11 with me as the mission leader. My feelings were conflicted. I burned with a desire to uncover who was behind what happened to Virgil and what the true objective was. A mix of scientific curiosity and an insatiable drive for discovery accompanied this, but I was also deeply worried for my own life. What truly perplexed me was the conversation I had with the NASA administrator at his residence shortly before the flight. He told me he had concrete reasons to believe humans had been to the moon before. Initially, I thought he wasn't serious, but the situation was different. I probed him, hoping to learn how he came across this information, but he clearly stated that he wasn't authorized to disclose the source. Of course, it wasn't hard for me to guess who that source might be. Apart from this, what I learned was that the planned landing site for Apollo 11 differed from what would officially be recorded. If necessary, a simulated space mission filmed in a studio was ready to cover up the event, and we were to keep our mouths shut. According to the information he had apparently received from the same source, our true mission was to locate a vehicle still on the moon's surface. Supposedly, a section of the vehicle contained samples from genetic experiments conducted by scientists, and we were tasked with retrieving and safely bringing them back to Earth. The launch took place on July 16, 1969, thankfully without incident. On July 20th, we arrived at our destination without any technical glitches. What Aldrin and I witnessed was utterly breathtaking. While the administrator had been serious, I had never believed his claims could be true. But now it stood before us. The spherical spacecraft's design was clearly not of our civilization. In my overwhelmed state, I couldn't deduce who made it, for what purpose, or how long it had been there. Aldrin and I approached on foot. Just a few meters away, the ship's door opened on its own, and in a trance-like state, we silently ventured inside. Finding what we were looking for wasn't difficult. Aldrin and I transported some of the samples step by step, first to the lunar module, then to the command module. Unfortunately, the limited space in the command module forced us to leave many of our discoveries inside the mysterious spacecraft. During this process, I had a profoundly strange personal experience that I still haven't fully understood. Towards the end of transferring the findings to the lunar module, I left Aldrin there and entered the spacecraft alone. Shortly after, I felt unwell and fainted. While unconscious, I had an extraordinary dream that I remember vividly even today. A tall man with long white hair and beard, piercing eyes, and an unusual, though military-like uniform approached me. He spoke in a language I had never heard before, yet I understood every word. He told me my mission wasn't complete, and that I had left something on the ship that needed to be brought back to Earth. He gestured to help me find it. According to him, the object would soon reveal all truths when humanity's technology reached a sufficient level. Until then, I had to ensure it was delivered to Earth and kept safe. That was the end of my dream. The next thing I remember is lying unconscious on the spacecraft's floor while Aldrin tried to wake me. I quickly recovered, and we continued our work without significant delays. I was certain it was just a dream, until I found a small, unfamiliar piece of technology on me. I was sure it hadn't been there before and suspect it might be a recording device. I decided to hide it in this glass tube with this letter. I never told anyone about this, not even Aldrin or Collins. After returning to Earth, we handed over the samples to NASA and underwent a brief quarantine before resuming our normal lives. But my anxiety and doubts never left me. Not long after, I learned of Michael Collins' death. This could not have been a coincidence. My turn would come. I hope and believe that all of this will be uncovered someday. Neil Armstrong, 1969. Although Simon Blake was aware of how big and sensational his discovery was, he wasn't too surprised. He caught sight of the small device that Armstrong claimed to have brought from the moon. He thought Jimmy Perkins could do something about it. At that moment, his cell phone rang. It was Pavlov who called. Pavlov summed up what had happened. "I wanted to talk to you before I reported it to the police. How are you doing?" This time, it was Blake who summed up the situation. "Wow. What are we going to do about this part of the business? First, you will have to make up a convincing excuse for the police about what you are looking for in the middle of the forest. Then we will take this device that I told you about to our friend who is a computer genius and hope that it will get the result. If what is written in the letter is true, we are talking about something produced by a completely different technology of a completely different world. I doubt even our Jimmy can do anything about it. But if it gets results, it seems like we'll see the real bombshell then. While Jimmy is dealing with this, we'll tell Selena about the developments." "Okay. So what happened to that tattoo I told you about?" "Oh, it doesn't really matter." The next day, while Blake was busy with his business at the university as if nothing had happened, Pavlov dealt with annoying formalities. As the body was being exhumed by the authorities and taken to the morgue for examination, Pavlov was trying to formalize his creative scenario that he had spotted the man by chance while hiking in the woods to take advantage of the weekend holiday. On the morning of the next day, the two friends had the opportunity to visit first Jimmy Perkins and then Selena Armstrong. Perkins didn't say anything clear about the alien microchip. Selena couldn't hold back her tears when she found out what had happened. After an uneventful week, Jimmy Perkins called Pavlov. "Hi Jimmy. How are you? What about the situation? Shall we give up hope in you?" "I don't know that place, big boy. I called to ask something. When was the last time you and Blake went to the movies?" "Movie? What does that mean now?" "They've been making no good movies lately, are they, man? But if you come to me tomorrow, I can show you the best movie you've ever seen." "But..." Before Pavlov could finish, Perkins hung up. Pavlov was smiling. "Bioaccelerator? Have you lost your mind?" Instead of answering, Maureen contented herself with a brazen grin. The conversation between Coleman and Maureen was heated. It had only been a few seconds since Maureen had told Dr. Nathan Coleman that the cloned baby should be put into the bioaccelerator, which was still in the experimental stage, but the thought was enough to make Coleman lose himself. Bioaccelerator was a scientific process aimed at accelerating the biological development processes of natural or genetically modified organic structures for various reasons. The project was based on the assumption that if the subject was exposed to an environment that simulated the outside world in a certain accelerated way, while administering anabolic hormones, antibiotics, receptor stimulants and neuroleptics to the subject in the appropriate environment, the rate of biological development and growth would increase significantly. "I can't let you do that. This is crazy." It's unclear whether the bioaccelerator produces healthy results even on normal organisms. "You know that as well as I do." Blushing with rage, Coleman made fists with his hands as he spoke. Showing no emotional signs, Maureen said in a robotic voice and with a vague smile, "Coleman, that's an order." At the same time he felt a punch land on his nose and then on his stomach. Coleman, a scientist who had shied away from physical activity and violence all his life, lost control for the first time and punched someone. "But..." Maureen let out a laugh. "You shoot like a girl, Coleman. Your fists are like a joke. If I wanted to, I would have easily blocked you and made you pay dearly. But I didn't. Do you know why?" Coleman looked at him as if to say, "Why?" "Because frankly, you're completely right to act like that." As Nathan Coleman turned and walked out of the room with quick steps, Maureen was watching him with thoughtful glances from behind the man. May 2, 1989. The first cloned human baby is put into bioaccelerator at the behest of Maureen, despite the objections of Dr. Nathan Coleman. At the end of the first 20 days, the baby developed beyond expectations and reached the physical appearance of a person of about 1.5 years. Coleman and others decided to remove it from its artificial environment at certain times of the day and to apply the next part of the experiment only part-time. Coleman was beginning to think that perhaps he was being too cautious and prejudiced. Developments were simply breathtaking. May 24, 1989. A baby became ill 12 hours after being taken out of the bioaccelerator and taken into the natural environment. His pulse increased, his fever rose. He began to breathe and sweat intermittently. First his face, then his whole body began to redden. He lost consciousness. Despite all the interventions made, the first cloned human could not be saved. It was obvious that the studies carried out to understand where the problem originated would not be satisfactory in a short time. Perhaps it was necessary to look for the problem not in the scientific method, but in the weaknesses of human psychology. The cloning process using stem cells, which Maureen and his team believed belonged to the character referred to in the holy books and ancient historical sources by names such as the prophet Noah, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, etc., had failed. The project was postponed to an indefinite time. Nathan Coleman retires. Professor Simon Blake, Major Boris Pavlov, Selena Dale Armstrong, and David Brewster gathered at James Perkins' house the next day. According to Jimmy, a glorious show that gave it all was waiting for them. Pavlov winked at Jimmy and said, "How did you manage that? We know it's capable, but it seems there's a mechanism going back thousands of years. You don't find ahead with us, do you?" he asked. Jimmy said, "The secret to the profession is big man." "I think I have an opinion on that," Blake interjected. "We know how resourceful our young friend is, but I think it's theoretically close to impossible to achieve such a technological overlap. Still, there may be a much simpler explanation for the situation." Everyone in the room was looking at Blake. Professor continued. "If we can have one of the technological devices left over from the civilization of thousands of years ago, why not more?" Perkins shrugged. "What about that tattoo?" Blake found several screenshots that he had previously saved on his smartphone. On the one hand, he began to explain by showing these images. The main figure in the tattoo is created by drawing a kind of hybrid of two familiar mythological characters, Griffin and Phoenix. The lion-bodied, eagle-winged griffin often symbolizes victory and peace. In Turkish mythology, the phoenix lives on Mount Kaf. In Greek mythology, it is reborn from the ashes after death, and in Taoism it symbolizes spiritual enlightenment and evolution. The triangle may symbolically refer to the belief in the Trinity, the God-man-universe Trinity, the Egyptian pyramids, Freemasonry, and the legend of Hiram. "If I quit, you'll talk until morning," Perkins interjected. "I'm making the most important discovery of all time, you're chattering. Now stand firm." In his room, which was full of technological items on all sides, he began to show his guests the three-dimensional hologram images that Armstrong had obtained by deciphering the mysterious recording system he had brought from space. Final. About 70,000 years ago, in the region of the Atlantic Ocean known as the Bermuda Triangle, where more than 25 planes and more than 50 ships have disappeared without a trace, there was once a group of islands rising with a total surface area of about 4,000 square kilometers, a period too old to be mentioned in any written source. The island had no road connection with what is now known as the Americas. The island was home to a number of military and scientific facilities that were accessible only to those specializing in certain branches. It seems that after thousands of years of chaos, mankind has finally managed to establish a civilization where permanent peace reigns. Art and science were exalted as never before in history, and technology eliminated all practical difficulties. The insatiable ambitions of politicians were restrained and the hate speeches that polarized the people were silenced. The justice system functioned so healthily that it hardly victimized anyone. The economic system was transparent and fair enough not to abuse anyone. Health care was provided to everyone relatively equally. No one was punished because of their ethnicity, beliefs, or thoughts. People also internalized the importance of treating nature with respect. Violence was minimized. At least that was the case for an outside eye. The island was largely isolated from the mainland for security reasons. It was from here that the clean energy needed for the permanence of ideal life on the mainland was supplied. Nevertheless, there could always be some unexpected complications in the functioning of the system. The possible annoying consequences of such a situation would naturally have to be kept away from the civilized world, for which the island's isolated location provided a fertile ground for this. Ultimately, establishing a world order was no easy task. You couldn't get that by being completely innocent or transparent. It was acceptable enough to pay some price if necessary and to hide some facts from the world. A group of people who controlled what was happening on the island thought this way. But not all. The dissenting voices first came from the unit where genetic research was conducted. A few elderly professors raised their voices, trying to warn others of the danger, but they were not taken seriously. When they persisted, some of their projects were suspended and temporarily suspended. The truth shouldn't have been so important to anyone. Then they were joined by 3 officers who commanded the private security army, Peter, Jacob, and Noah. Their fate was no different. After the events calmed down, the opposition group, which understood that they would not be able to get results openly, began to think about the details of the protocol to be put into effect secretly in case of an emergency. On that day, it became clear beyond doubt that the opposition group was entirely right in its concerns. The source of the violent tremors was not understood at first. In the beginning, everyone thought it was an ordinary earthquake. But instead of stopping, the tremors became increasingly severe. All electronic devices are disabled. Communication was broken. The island went dark. Hiding in bunkers didn't work. In the face of the severity of the tremor, all the safety measures taken in advance were helpless. The largest of the group of islands consisting of 3 natural parts, the piece of land of about 3,000 square kilometers, which forms the epicenter of scientific research, was first torn in 2 by breaking off large crackles, then swallowed up by the ocean, which collapsed into itself and formed huge waves. Huge Island was sinking like a boat. Then it was the turn of the land where the nuclear reactor was located. The environment, which had been pitch black a few minutes before, was illuminated this time by a light so strong that it blinded the eyes. The light of the explosion rose for miles in the sky, turning into a giant sphere. It covered an area of thousands of square kilometers. After once again swallowing the island, which had already been buried under the waters under the influence of the tremor, it began to move in a northwesterly direction without losing its severity. After swallowing 1/5 of the continent we call America today, he could not get his ambition and continued on his way to the region where the Asian continent is today. By the time the massive nuclear explosion, which lasted about 10 hours, finally subsided, nearly half of the world's population had already died. The remainder would die in less than a month from the nuclear fallout and the indirect effects of the disaster. Except for one person. Noah knew immediately that the moment had come as the concussions began. It wasn't hard for him to sneak in from the space base in the mess. Although the concussions made it significantly difficult for him to progress, he had enough time. At least he hoped so. He brought his right eye closer for a retinal scan. Confirmed. The door of the ship opened silently. He boarded the ship in the form of a sphere with a diameter of about 20 meters. He opened the cryptic bag he had brought with him as carefully as possible. The pre-selected sample carefully removed the DNA tubes. He just stared at it for a few seconds. If only you were Rovk. He quickly placed it in the pre-prepared section of the ship. He then pulled out a few pieces from the other compartment of the bag, resembling today's USB sticks. He went to the ship's command center, opened the transparent compartment on the lower right side of the control panel, inserted the memories, then entered a password and closed the panel. He took a deep breath. Mumbling something from within, he started the countdown to the firing. The triangular shape on the forehead of the colossal creature was now shining brighter than it had in centuries. The cylindrical glass chamber in which it was imprisoned began to crack under the strain of the tremors. A few minutes later, it shattered completely, and the bright pale green liquid that was not meant to sustain life but to keep it under control spilled out rapidly under the pressure. Finally it was free. Raising its arms, it lifted its head toward the sky. It let out a deafening cry of triumph, a kind of scream no mortal had ever heard before. The kind that did not belong to this world. Then it calmed itself. Its heartbeat slowed. It closed its eyes and waited patiently as it always did, until it could foresee in vivid detail what was about to happen. It paid no attention to the collapsing world around it while doing so. This was exactly what it wanted. Then, suddenly it opened its eyes. It knew precisely what it had to do. With unwavering confidence, it took off in a particular direction, running faster and faster. And without hesitation, it hurled itself off the cliff hundreds of meters high.